Okay, so this is the second video, and what I normally do in this session is I walk through some historical significant pieces that kind of inform how we read the classics. Now, again, this is something that usually is done over multiple hours, and I don't want to do that. So some of the slides will go by really fast, and you are always welcome to email me or try to get a hold of me through the mycompasschurch.com email, or you can call on the phone number I provided, things like that. But the issue is, if you have questions, get a hold of me. But I'm not trying to make this go long for you. What I want to do is just give you some insight about how this is going to work. There's going to be 3 sections, lots of slides, but I'll try to keep it short. Here we go. So this is going to be some basic work of what we talk about, okay? Let me go back to this. Just so you know, with the Bible issues, that's one short piece. The emotional response, it's a little more difficult, but historical overview, if these words don't make a lot of sense, here's the truth. Ready? Skip it. I mean it. Skip it. Fast forward. If you're like, this doesn't apply to me, that's okay. The bigger issue by far is if you are reading, if you are growing. That's far more important. If this makes a difference in your ministry, that matters. If you're not going to take a test over things like modality and sodality. That's not the issue. It's to inform you about your reading. And if you think to yourself, that's not important for me, keep going. All right, so when we talk about Bible reading, one of those things that we want to talk about is how we reflect on the Bible. You can't just read it, you have to reflect it. You need to have dialogue with the Bible. Now, we've already talked about leverage, things like that. All these things regarding Bible reading, the biggest danger, honestly, is the issue of applicability versus ministry fodder. Look, we have to read the Bible to do ministry. We have to. I did a long study of Galatians recently in order to do a series of 6 podcasts on Galatians and then preach one of the sermons in the series on Galatians. Of course, we have to do that. But we can not only do that. We also must listen to the Word of God for us, right? I'm going to assume that you know this by now. If you've gotten this far in the program, I'm going to assume that you guys have figured this part out. Here's just a couple ideas. Take a long passage study, like 2 months over Deuteronomy 17, or read Josiah on leadership. Those are pretty easy. So you can see that that's what I'm trying to find. Here's my major question. Can you make your Bible reading applicable to ministry? By that I mean, can you coordinate it so that people can be involved with it? Can you reinforce the Word of God? Can you give it some structure? All right. So Michael and Bob Benson, a father-son team, I think the father has since passed. I'm not sure if Michael, the younger, is still alive, but they wrote a book called Disciplines for the Inner Life a long time ago. And what it was a week's worth of devotions in 52 chapters. So you had an entire year worth of devotions just to get you into the habit. So when I was a youth pastor, a long time ago, way back in the early 90s, right when word processors first came out, I decided to modify their concept with my students because I was trying to get my students involved in some kind of reading spiritual habits. And so what I did was I realized these kids didn't have the cash to get a hardback book and the discipline to walk through it, but I figured out they could read one page and hold on to it, especially if their friends started helping them. So this is what we did. We did 25 weeks, and it was basically not quite an entire year. And so I would give them a modified version of this called Lifeline. You can tell by my awesome graphics here. And the idea was that there was a theme, and then on one side there were these pieces, and on the back side of the page there was a place to journal, things like that. And so they just started to read. I would just give them a little bit, right? There's a Thomas Kempis prayer here. There's something by Philip Brooks. And I would try to highlight something like this. We might wake up and find that we've been very busy with the husks and trappings of life and really miss life itself. And so when I thought about obedience and things like that, it gave them a chance to have some Bible, some Psalms, and a chance to just engage reading. So that's what I'm trying to get at with applicability to ministry. Now, again, I'm going to assume that if you're this far into this program, you know how to do this. So you can see how this works. In regards to people who are hungry, okay, what I want to say is give homework and high rewards to people. This has worked in my ministry both with grown-ups and students when they have both a very high bar to reach for and high reward in the experience of it. People tend to do far, far more than I gave them credit for. It started out, I began teaching a course called Bible Basics in Amarillo, and I made it difficult to get into because I had students that had been going to Sunday school their whole lives. They were tired of the same old, wanted something deeper. And so I said, well, you have to do homework, you have to buy a textbook. And I made all these rules. There's memorization work, and I had 65 kids the first day. So I said, no, you don't understand. This is what it's going to be. And you're going to get to really know the Bible and learn a lot about stuff. And they all were like, yeah, no, we get it. Only 2 of them dropped out, and that was only because sports made them miss too many to stay in it. And they came back the next semester. Then they were like, well, let's get some more. Pretty soon I had 100 kids in Bible Basics. And here's all I'm trying to get at. If you lead well, if you help people see that there is both a very, very high reward for knowing the Word of God, and you set a very high standard for them, an enormous amount of people, far more than people give it credit for, will get serious about reading the Word of God. And then that has a lot of access towards transformation. Here was my Bible Basics schedule. You can look over that if you want to, and if I'm going too fast, you can press pause. But these were the pieces that I had them do. They had to learn all kinds of stuff, and memory work, and different chapters, all kinds of stuff. Now, here's some things about reading that a lot of people won't talk about that are fairly significant. Remember I talked about your cultural bias determines your first emotional response to reading from another culture, right? So, things like this. I grew up on a farm, so my question is, hey, is this helpful, right? It's part of my nature. It's part of my personality. It's part of my family culture. Hey, does this help? If not, it's a waste of time, right? Other people are like, is it beautiful? Things like that. Is it pedantic, plain spoken? All, right? If somebody says yes, if I read a book and I get these things, is it pedantic? No. Is it plain spoken? Yes. Is it deep and impressive? Woo, yeah, it's awesome. Then I'm like, hey, it's 95% good. Now, here's what happens is that when we read poorly, we think of people in terms of them and us, right? Who's us? In our doctrinal alignment, in our racially or socioeconomic circles. When we think in terms of them and us, what we do is we keep ourselves from learning about them at all, and making sure that there's never going to be a true us. Now, part of that is culture. You can go a little bit further on these if you want to. You can look these up on the internet. Polychronic versus monochronic talks about cultures that care about time. Poly meaning many, mono meaning one. The easiest example is that Switzerland is the most monochronic culture in the world. That's why they care so much about accurate watches. Mexico is a polychronic culture, which is why stereotypically people say Mexicans are never on time and things never start on time. I don't know if you've ever gone to a Latin church service where they say it starts 11, nobody's even there till 11:15, no one starts till 12:25, and then they have a 2-hour service, and then they have lunch at 4. Now, again, if you are monochronic, that's going to drive you out of your mind, right? If you are polychronic, however, that's going to feel normal and gracious and good. Now, that's not right or wrong. That's just the way cultures perceive things. So I have read books that talk about if you have an appointment with the King of Kings at 6 a.m., get up and have that appointment with the Lord at 6 a.m. Now, in a monochronic culture, that might be perfect. That might be totally wise. In a polychronic culture, that smacks of legalism. So knowing both your emotional makeup and your culture helps how you read. Collectivism versus individualism is all about how much power does the group have versus the individual. Masculine, feminine, that's obvious. High or low context. This is a little more complicated. Using your context to communicate, using your clothing, or a very, very good example of this is in traditional rural Japan. A wife is not really supposed to tell her husband she's upset about something. And the way she's supposed to communicate that is to make sure that something in the room, a picture on the wall perhaps, maybe the flower arrangement in the table, is askew. It is his job to notice, and then he is supposed to say, "My dearest, is there something wrong?" And the first 2 times he asks that, her response is supposed to be no. If he continues to ask, then it means he really wants to know, and then she can tell him. She is required to use her context to say what she feels. Now, if you grew up in a culture like that, you would assume that that's obvious for everybody, right? However, America, where I currently live and reside and have worked most of my life, except for that time in Latin America, is primarily a low context culture, meaning we use words to say exactly what we mean, and we try to mean exactly what we say. Now, you put into that the cowboy element, and I'm even more low context. Now, my wife is a southern Texas girl, and from a family of all girls. I'm a Yankee out west with a family full of boys. We are super low context. She's a little more high context. I have to be a little more savvy with that kind of thing. Power distance is how much distance between the people in power and the normal people is there. In a high power distance culture, it's expected that the people in power get lots of money, get lots of nice things. One time I was visiting a culture in North Africa, and the king was driving by in his motorcade, and the people were so excited that after his motorcade passed, they kissed the ground, and they feel sorry for him that he's still driving his dad's Bentley. You know, he should have his own. It's just, but here's the thing: high power distance cultures, the people are expected to take care. The people in charge are expected to take care of their people. So we come from a low power distance culture. Now, if you are reading a monastic who lives in a monastery with a high power distance culture, meaning the abbot has absolute formal, utter rule over these people, he's going to write in such a way that it might seem really weird to your cultural context. Uncertainty avoidance, long term, you can see how this goes. Now, this is where this gets really, really important. In church history, right, you can see that I've got this pendulum here, right? In church history, if you started up here where my cursor is, you went down this way, and that was historical timeline, right? You're going to find that historically, the church all over the world goes back and forth between these two things. It happens all the time. And what's very interesting is that you can trace this. Now, here's a big piece of what this means. On this side, you have the organized, very systematic, doctrinally pure, very staid, tried and true, organized group. Over here, you have people doing revivals and all kinds of things like new movements and new ideas like 24-hour prayer movements and stuff like that. It's not necessarily something that the church officials themselves organize. It just kind of spontaneously pops up. So you got a Wycliffe Bible translators because the church wasn't doing enough. And because you got, we're not helping poverty. And what you get is that this goes back and forth. Sometimes it goes fast, sometimes it goes slow. But if your writer is over here, okay, like Shane Claiborne, I don't know if you read Shane Claiborne. If your writer is over here, he's going to have some probably antithesis or antagonism toward this side. If he's on this side or she is on this side, she's going to have some kind of feeling that maybe this isn't the right way to go. You want to know kind of this is why background checks matter. If you're reading a prophet like a Keith Green or somebody like that, you know that Keith Green's way over on this side. He's way over here. But you read about like N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is way, way, way over here, right? It's part of the Anglican Communion. So this really is helpful. And again, you don't have to understand, and there's no test on this. All I want to get at is that your writer, your author, she might really have a lot to say, but just take into account where she's saying it from. All right. Now watch this. Okay. On this side, you have church fathers, Athanasius, Ambrose, these guys, and the issues that they dealt with: heresies, Manichaeism, right? Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, blah, blah, blah. And then you swing way over here, you got this new group of people. Think guys like this. Antony instead of Athanasius. You got Pachomius and the Celts and Cassian all these people, they're like, nope, this isn't working right. This isn't what we want. And they go whoosh way over here and start something totally new. Well, like Benedict, okay, around the year 500, he starts his stuff, and people get real serious about it, and it gets all set up like this, and the priests have to come out of the Benedictine order. The priests, they go, no, we've got to get it started. So Martin Luther's over here, things like that. So think in terms of prophets and rebels on this side, right? Think in terms of organized and disciplined on this side. Now, again, that's broad generalization, but at least gives you a little bit of hint about where they're coming from. Now, this is the part where I got into some historical depth, trying to give people, in particular, some of the Catholic writers, but we're just going to go through this pretty quick. The early church's basic issue was defense of the movement and encouraging new believers, because trying to find out what's right, stop the heresies, and then there were this persecution. And so what they were trying to do, right, is build a liturgy. Remember, we talked about leverage. And here's the heart of it. They were trying to forge this like scattered group of people that had gone all over the Mediterranean Sea area into something far bigger and more difficult to manage. They were trying to like rein in the crazy a little bit. So a lot of the early church, when they wrote, that's what they were doing. So again, you can look at this all you want to. This is just, there's a lot here. It's really worth thinking about, but maybe not in our particular time. Origen, of course, he's a good example of this. When Origen writes, there's some things you need to know about it. His father was martyred in 202. He was going to try to go martyr himself and follow his dad's footsteps, but his mom hid all of his clothes while they were doing laundry, so he couldn't leave the house naked. He wrote a book, right, Contra Celsum, and what it means is there was another pastor theologian named Celsus, and this means against Celsus. It's a refutation. So when he writes his book, he's writing a particular argument, and he was also a total hardcore Neoplatonist. And, right, he emasculated himself because he read the scripture, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Right, I think you see where I'm going with this. But he was taking the Bible so literally that Origen, has a lot to say, but you don't want to read Origen as a theologian for modern times, like without a lot of filter, right? Augustine has the same concept. You're going to watch all this, and you can look this stuff up on Wikipedia. It's not like it's hard to find. Some of this won't be in there, but he was an outsider to Rome and watched Rome fall from a distance. The monastics themselves developed something called a rule. The rule wasn't like laws. It was, a better word for rule is rhythm, right? Benedict in particular was the genius behind this. And there's so much to talk about Benedict. He probably in many ways launched the revolution of Christianity in Europe. But one of the things they did, the monastics, is they did something called technological diffusion, meaning one monastery would build a better mill instead of, like, for example, when a mill pond or mill river, the water would come in and go underneath like this, right? It would drive the mill shaft. They figured out that if the water comes over the top, it actually creates more torque, and so they would build a dam and a diversionary dam, and then they would run a ditch, and they would line it with cement and rocks, and then it would come over the top. They would get more torque and get a bigger millstone and things like that. Whether it was ways to make cloth, ways to do hybrid crops, cattle, sustaining their life, brewing better beer, those kinds of things. What they would do, as soon as they got a better idea, instead of keeping it to themselves, the monastics would copy it out, and then they would run it to 10 different monasteries around them to share. And they would take, that's called technological diffusion. Now, there were a lot of those guys writing spiritual growth stuff, and they would do the same thing. They'd make a copy and they'd send it on. Well, we'll get more into that later. All right, so that's our first piece. I want to go to the next one, which is this Enlightenment through 1969. Now, this is a little more complicated because, such tremendous historical change happened from the Enlightenment on. But we're going to race through it, and I apologize. So if I was teaching this on a weekly thing, I would review the modality and sodality in the pendulum and these historical tensions between organization and new ideas. All right, so the Reformation. 1555, the Peace of Augsburg is signed after decades of war, after the Reformation began. And it was built on the concept of hegemony. If you don't know what hegemony means, it's the concept of Christendom. I'll show you what this means here. Okay, you might look here. And the idea was, as goes the prince of any of these little areas, okay, look at that date there, as goes the prince, for example, of Bavaria, so goes the population. So let's say after the Reformation, Bavaria chose Catholicism instead of Lutherans. Well, automatically everybody there is a Catholic. Same thing over here. If all of a sudden the prince says, nope, we're Lutherans, everybody's a Lutheran. And what that hegemony is, the idea that everybody inside a kingdom is the same religion. So, again, that's modality. And they called it Christendom. Problem is they got outcasts in sodality, right? And splinter modalities. And so everything from Jan Hus and Hulla and the Pietists and the Moravians, these guys were basically splinters and things like that. These guys in particular were very, very good writers, leaders, thinkers, teachers, pastors. Very, very profound. This is the University of Halle. In the 15 and 1600s, there was a guy named August Francke who started the Pietist movement. And the Pietist movement is one of those things that really changed the course of Christianity. And he helped get the Moravians started. This is where the Moravian Christian influence was. The Moravians influenced John Wesley, right? Who Great Awakening in the United States, that kind of thing. Big issue. All right. Here's some historical issues. First off, after the Enlightenment, you get this new thing about study and exploration. And you got boats that can go around the world. This is a picture of the HMS Victory. 105 guns on this ship. And travel all of a sudden was something you could survive regularly. And at this time, in England in particular, in the English-speaking world, they were against the idea of emotional kinds of religion. And so they were anti-enthusiastic. The Methodists had a lot of persecution. But now that there's all these colonies and you can travel and you don't necessarily have to die, there was this explosion of opportunity for the gospel and for writings. Look at this. These are Cook's routes. Look at all the different places he went to and tried. And Cook became so famous instantly after his first thing. Even a cabin boy on one of Captain Cook's voyages would get a lifetime of speaking opportunities he could make a living. Here's the point. The Moravians began the modern missionary movement and began reporting what's going on around the world. Colonialism made open doors for Europeans to go to other places and preach. Obviously, with colonialism, there were some new evils. And what you got was, on the modality side, that's the Anglican Church. On the sodality side, this new idea of how to reach these people that they called the heathen. Right? And then you had these revivals. Hegemony versus enthusiasm, modal versus soul. You can see where the tension comes. Now, you can look at this. All of these people, right, are revivals. And the Enlightenment was saying, no, science, pure reason, stop with the emotion. And then you got these incredible revivals. Like, for example, the one that started the Restoration Movement, where LCU came out of, 1801 in Cane Ridge. You had all these people, this is where Pentecostalism started. You have all these people doing this incredible experience in opposition to the Enlightenment. Pendulum again. Now here's the kicker. Ready? Who are you reading? If you're reading somebody on this side about passion, you're talking, D.L. Moody, you're talking about Spurgeon, you're talking about some of those guys. If you read somebody on this side, they're going to have an entirely different take on what you're trying to get at, right? In particular, once you get to about here, when you started seeing signs and wonders and miracles and stuff like that, you have other people on the other side saying that's totally false, that's from the devil, blah, blah. Now, these things, these things are just external issues that I go into that you can look up every single one of those and you can probably figure out the connection yourself. But here's where this gets pretty serious, okay? When Marx and egalitarianism come into play, right? Nietzsche, World War I and II, and this new humanism and social action, what you got was an entire new division of Christian writers. If you read this guy, Albert Schweitzer, you would start to wonder, does he actually believe Jesus was really a real person? Because he was such a big friend of social action and such a big friend of humanism. But he claimed to be a Christian, and you go, Now, does that mean you shouldn't read Albert Schweitzer? I'm not saying that. He's got a lot to say. In fact, his life was one of the most amazing witnesses to the love of Jesus I've ever heard of. However, you got to know which side of that coin he was on before you start reading his books as if they're gospel. This is where it gets dangerous. Now, what's all that have to do with us? That was just kind of stuff up to 1969. And what that means is we have had this long trajectory between dividing science and reason and emotion and faith, all that stuff. You get up into the Vietnam era where all of a sudden atrocities and soldiers and the baby boomers and things like Woodstock and things like that are going on. You get postmodernism, meaning we don't trust anything, blah, it goes crazy. What's going on in the church? You got this new revival in megachurches in the 80s, especially the 80s and the 90s. People were freaking out about megachurches. But it's in response to all these things happening in our culture. That's very complicated. And here's the truth. When we have a whole day to walk through those issues together, it becomes a lot more apparent about who you're reading and which person you chose to read and things like that. The majority of the group this year has chosen people that are recent authors, so it's not as vital as we walk through that. However, once we get to this choice of authors, here are some people that Foster really recommends. E.M. Bounds. And you got to know where E.M. Bounds is coming from. He was in the South in the Civil War era. That means he's going to have some issues, right? He was a deep, deep revivalist, profound revivalist. And so his work on prayer is brilliant, but you need to know where he's coming from. Jonathan Edwards, of course, is in the First Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards is a hardcore Calvinist, but in that era, there were very few people who were not, right? So in some of that regards, Jonathan Edwards can be forgiven. And Edwards was less of a practicing Calvinist than he was a theoretical Calvinist, at least from what I can tell. Hudson Taylor, the father of modern missions, at least European modern missions, he had the vast privilege of experiencing God in an entirely new cultural context and yet still not abandoning his cultural roots. An amazing guy that is a great spiritual. Besides being known for missions, he's often overlooked in regard to his spiritual formation techniques. Andrew Murray, a South African man who, and just incredible. These are all people that Foster would recommend as people that you would read and get a lot out of. I would agree with that list. I think I like Amy Carmichael the least, not because she's a lady, but because she was, for a long time, she was racked with pain because of a debilitating disease. And sometimes when she writes, to me it sounds like the pain is coming out stronger than what she really means it to. Here's a few more. Karl Barth and Bonhoeffer and Merton and Kelly and Lewis and Ockhamar, things like that. When I talk to young theologians in particular, I try to be, it's almost inevitable they'll get it on Bonhoeffer and his poignancy, his clarity of insight, in particular, his passion for God, tend to wire him up, and they start reading things and saying that's true. And again, you have to remember, not only was he German, he was a German Lutheran, and not only that, he was in the middle of World War II, so it's going to be problematic. Right? Thomas Merton, same thing. He's a 1950s Trappist monk who, if you read his book, Seven Story Mountain, which I highly, highly recommend, Merton was a genius. What you find is that Merton was one of those guys that was deeply experiential. And sometimes as he got older, he became much more interested in the emotion and the mystery of the gospel rather than in the plain truth of the gospel. So some of his early writings I like a lot. Some of his later writings are difficult. Thomas Kelly is my personal favorite out of this whole list. Thomas Kelly's book, Testament of Devotion, is one of the few books I've read more than 8 times. His insight and intelligence, he was a professor at multiple places. His intelligence alone was remarkable. But on top of that, his life, he was a Quaker, and his life as a missionary and as a servant of God and as a teacher and as a mom, as a dad and a husband to his wife, his life was such a profound witness. One of the things I respect most about him is that till the day he died from a brain tumor, he was passionate about the presence of God in alignment with things that are true. He's hard to beat, in my opinion. C.S. Lewis, of course, and the Occam Martyrs. If you don't know who that is, you can look that up. These are all people that I like a lot. Foster's book, Streams of Living Water, is one of the finest examples of how God has used multiple streams of Christianity to reach the world. Here's some recent authors just to look for. In particular, the Willard Foster connection I like a lot. I like Gordon MacDonald because he was a pastor for a long time. Brennan Manning because of his ragamuffin stuff. I think his best book is Signature of Jesus. Bryant Myers is hard to read because he's a genius and he spent 30 years as a missionary in India. Now, this has no connection with Foster. These are just some, let me say this. You can read whoever you want to. These are recent authors that personally I just can't connect with, okay? I can't connect with Rob Bell. Seems like a great guy. What he writes, I don't like. I'm not a big Francis Chan guy, not because he, again, great guy. Don't like his writing. Piper, same thing. I don't like the Reformed Calvinist approach. I think in particular it has some logical fallacies and laziness that I dislike a little bit. I don't like any of the emergent author, especially Brian McLaren and some of those guys. Activists like Shane Claiborne. But here's some new authors for me that I like a lot. I do like Karl Barth. I waited a long time, and Barth at the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II says things to modern people that very few other people can say. His commentary on Romans is kind of his most well-known piece. I do like G.K. Chesterton. He was a Catholic, but he was the kind of thinking Catholic that really helps. N.T. Wright, pretty great. Again, I love Bonhoeffer. And personally, I really dig a lot of missiology, but you know, for most people, that's a lot like, so read what you like. I do like Patrick O'Brien's historical fiction, the Master and Commander series. It's actually 20 novels that actually are one long story. It's pretty masterful, to be honest. The guy's a genius. Here's some new areas that I'm working on, academic writing authors and writing motivation books. I've had to read those for my dissertation. Now, we're going to skip to this part about developing bibliographies because this is part of what you're going to do, okay? Here's what you do with the annotated bibliography. You start off with this question. To what end are you writing this? Are you trying to vent and argue? That can be legit if you are in, for example, if you are working with a group of students or people who struggle about believing in God. If you want to argue the case that God is a logical possibility, and the books you're going to list there are all about apologetics and so you start with beginner books, J. Warner Wallace and Lee Strobel. You move up to more advanced books like, Frank Turek or Josh McDowell, Josh McDowell Jr. What's his name? Sean McDowell. And then if you want to get into some serious stuff, like the guy that found the human genome, right? Those guys. It's totally great that your bibliography is to argue a point. If it's about leadership, are you trying to educate people? Are you trying to get new kids, intermediate people, grown-ups, older folks? What is it? To what end are you building your bibliography? That helps before you even start. So here's my advice to you as you get close to the end of the class and you are working on your bibliography. Start with that. Who are you serving, and to what end do you write that? Right? Make this a living document. My bibliography over the years has changed. It started off as a simple book list that I made for students who said, man, you read a lot. What books do you recommend? Make sure that I seldom put new books on my bibliography, and one of the reasons I don't do that is I prefer ideas that are time-tested, right? We all know it's easy to let a fad move on, but stuff that would change Benedict and stuff that would change me regardless of our era, that's the stuff I want to know. Here's a few things to avoid. Well, you know what? I'm just soapboxing at this point. There's no reason for me to do that. Last, let's just say this. Get this vetted by some people that you trust and let them look over it. Because if you have one of those books on there and you forgot to do a background check and somebody else knows about it that you don't, it's really helpful to hear that and be like, oh, right. All right. Now, we're talking about how do you choose a future reading list. Same thing. Coherence with the Bible is what you're writing. Is what you're reading and then writing out as your list. Does it connect? Is it in line with what the Bible has to say? If it's not, I don't know, maybe you're not wasting your time, but I would suspect it's not all that worth it. Oops, sorry. It also needs to be congruent to reality, meaning you have people that will write things and say, we have to stop capitalism in its entirety because blah blah blah. That's not going to happen because of a few people, right? You're talking about global upsets before things like that change. Reality doesn't work like that. So if the people you're reading are congruent with the reality, coherent with the Bible, right? That's why you do background checks. Then what you do is you identify your own need. What is it you need to know, learn, hear about, things like that. In this regard, I want you to pay attention to your conscience. And what I mean by this is you say, as you listen, there's things that I want to read, and I'll be honest, I want to read them for pride. I remember I put a book on my reading list so that I could say I had read that. And as I began to read it, it wasn't for me, it was for my pride. It's embarrassing. So pay attention to your conscience. So my new reading list looks a little bit like this. Dissertation helps. I'm finally done with those. Writing helps. I do a lot more of that still. I still have a lot of writing I have to do. Things like this, how not to write your dissertation, how to write more, etc., etc. Now, I'm moving on a little bit from that, in particular, moving towards some more leadership. Part of that is some of my role at church is changing. I've talked about that recently. So, all right. Now, that was the second part. Now, let me finish with this, and this will be the end of the second video. Let me go back and just go through some of this stuff. So our culture messes us up. The modality, sodality, you need to vet your authors, all those things. As you learn more, you get compound learning. I want to talk to you a little bit about advanced reading, and if by this point you're so bored and you're so tired of the class, I don't blame you a bit. If you want to just press stop, feel free, I get it. But advanced reading is helpful as you grow older and as you bear more responsibility in ministry, because you begin to synthesize things that you've read. And you'll start to recognize things that don't cohere with reality. I can't remember the number, but there have been hundreds of plans to evangelize the remaining people of our generation. But that's been going on since the 1700s. So when you hear somebody writing about, we're going to evangelize the world now, in the next 20 years, I tend not to read that anymore, because I have seen and synthesized a little bit that every generation has a price to pay, a cost to do, and God is not done until he's done. And so when you synthesize, you get the 10,000 hour mark from Gladwell. You get the idea that the whole earth is waiting for God's glory from Piper. You get all these other things. You say, this is the kind of person I want to be. Synthesis is a big benefit of advanced reading. So one of the ways you do that is you journal. Journaling is very helpful because what you do is you take disparate concepts, you codify them in your own language, and you bring them together. That's really helpful. Another one is reflection, Lectio Divina, things like that. Referrals. Have people give you a good book to read. So again, you'll start noticing congruence with reality, with the Bible, with yourself. I can tell in the first 10 sentences if I'm going to resonate with an author. If I don't, I'm not going to read it. Unless, again, there's always an exception. But I'm just not going to read it if it's not congruent. In particular with good thinking. This is really important to me for a lot of reasons. Number one is, before I was a Christian, I was an atheist, and I thought it was because I was smart. And as time has gone on, I realized just how complicated the world is, or at least I'm getting a fraction of that. But when I was doing my dissertation, my professor was a remarkably sharp woman named Betsy Glanville. And when I was doing my outline, she said I had some flaws in my logic. And of course, I was like, I disagree with that. I don't think that's true. And I kept arguing, and finally she wrote a piece of paper out and she said, you have to read this book before you can continue with your work with me. I was like, oh, okay, sorry. I go to the library, I pick up the book. It's called Thinking Skills. It was pretty humiliating and kind of, tough to hear that I wasn't thinking very clearly, but she was right. I mean, really, really right. What I was saying may or may not have been true, but I wasn't saying it in a way that revealed good thinking that is in line with what God does, how God has built our world, how God has revealed himself. Those things really matter, because if we're going to say this is important for people, well, our thinking is pretty important. Now, when you think about pilgrimage planning, I read this book called Stumbling on Happiness. Daniel Gilbert is not a Christian. He is actually an evolutionary psychologist. He's the chair of this, or he was when he wrote this, the chair of the psychology department at Harvard. Okay, so he's not dumb. And he talks about the phenomenon of happiness. And one of the things he talks about is that we imagine the future in a certain way. And when we imagine it, we do something called pre-feeling, right? We project ourselves in a future state, and then we pre-feel what it's going to be like to do that. Now, what happens is, we also, when we think backwards, we misremember, right? When people talk about the good old days, they're forgetting that the good old days were just the old days. There was lots of sorrow and suffering and sadness and boredom and drama and stuff like that. When we remember something we like, our brains tend to, fuzz out, erase the bad stuff. Or if it's bad, we just try to ignore it. So because we imagine the past wrong, usually misremember the past, and we project badly into the future, we often don't think clearly about what we're going to do. What are we going to be like at 75? Man, I don't know. I don't even know if I'll make it to 75. Imagine you're trying to get to Houston from Dallas, but you've got a roadmap from the 1930s. It's really tough, right? Here's what I'm trying to get at. Reading old stuff helps us avoid a lot of these major problems. I would really recommend reading this if you are interested in that kind of thing. Here's some other things you can read in. I would really recommend reading wisely in the spiritual warfare realm. This and missions, well, all of these can get really squirrely really fast. Be careful, get some good guidance. Wise people need to be good guides for these areas. All right. You can see that if you want to write, you need to read, right? You need to want it, you need to value it. None of these things are shocking. But the reality is that if you don't want to read, you're not going to. And if you can't convince other people why they should read, they won't either. So when it comes to things like your future plan, your annotated bibliography, and your report on what you've read from your author and your experience in the class, the writing at the end of the class, honestly, that's the stuff that I'm going to grade the hardest. Everything else is just practice getting you ready for those kinds of things. If you do a good job on your annotated, and hear me, follow the syllabus. Everything you need to know about how to write those is in that syllabus. If you have a question, email me at mycompaschurch.com and we can talk about it. But I'm going to end for now. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to see you in person. Please forgive me. This is a disappointing way to teach, but I hope it's at least slightly helpful. Feel free to go back, watch them again. Feel free to download them if you need to. If not, feel free to ignore them. God bless you guys for all the hard work that you've done. And I hope and I pray that there's a way that we do get to meet each other at one point. Let me